What is there to say about a character that is as much of a victim as she is a monster? When the story isn't lackadaisical with its cartoonish violence and unspeakable human obscenities, atrocities, and crimes against humanity, to arbitrary nonsense, all justified using insects as an allegory for human society, is a story about understanding the very fiction of freedom, toxic feminism, ad nauseum, living life as a woman, and surprisingly, I gotta check my notes on this one real quick. The Fermi paradox and the zoo hypothesis. Suffice to say, you can't be a hero and save the world by doing what you want to it. You know what you call a person who doesn't listen to anyone and tries to save the world on their own? A villain. This is a book about horrible people who do horrible things in a very discomforting way. A book that has female characters endure generations of violence, both emotional and sexual, and ultimately has its characters perpetuating that trauma instead of breaking the cycle and healing. The characters in this book excuse past events claiming to have overcome their demons and create neural ones in their worst forms, putting power in the hands of individuals who use their abilities to contort, degrade, torture, lie, and manipulate people and the world around them to reflect their own image. Because as I'll discuss later using found footage from a video I made over a year ago, when you cut to the quick of the overarching narrative of all the primary characters that have received the most development in this story, they are all blamed for everything wrong in their lives, as well as everyone else's, including parental figures and everyday people, which then in turn cause these characters to have no support as they are left to grieve alone with their own traumas and demons. Yet we're supposed to believe they all fall in love with the idea of turning the world into a paradise after suffering for their entire lives, which in reality they are suicidal, self-hating characters who just wanted to be loved, saw no worth in their own lives as long as they were being useful to someone else. But the problem with that is, again, and this will be addressed during the recap, this story reads like a hardcore feminist manifesto where the ideal feminist utopia is a world governed by a monarch and a secret police of unstoppable bone-breaking super assassins. But the primary problem with the girls rule, boys drool ideology preached in this book is that by curtain call, it says people who have experienced severe trauma are lost causes, and that their past experiences that they endure will just continue hurting the people around them, leading to chaos and violence, believing their own traumas will be a burden to others. Thus, they seek to create a world where that said pain doesn't exist, and in the process hurt people because the ends justify the means and the means self-justify into Big Sister 1984 dystopian nightmare land. To elaborate how this character operates, this is a book where the main character witnesses another woman suffer the same traumas as she did, and her solution to fix the issue was to immediately brainwash the character's mother into loving the daughter, artificially, which further pushed the rift between mother and child because the protagonist transformed the character's mother into what she believed was an ideal parental figure, at the cost of the character no longer resembling who she once was, thereby causing alienation and the overall destabilization of that family unit. But as long as the queen main character is happy, everyone else is, and I'll be back. You've got H-type manga like Hime, which is written by the author who wrote Killing Bites, and art by the artist who did Lord Marksman and Vanitas, who takes sake jokes from Metamorphosis way too far, and creates the main character of this book named Hime, who should have been named Ice Queen after she's bitten by a bee and grows a stringer inside of her uterus. And no, I'm not making this up. I wish I could, but I can't. She gains the power of a zombie bee and stabs people and they turn into her slaves. The problem with the book is that it reads like an ultra-feminist manifesto and kind of endorses the death and subjugation of all men, but at the same time, in the same book that has Donald Trump go live on international TV and lambast the Japanese government for allowing a 14-year-old girl and her terrorist friends to lead an insurrection and usurp the current status quo, only to reveal that a more power-hungry and sex-driven villain who likes forcing women into sex orgies with her powers is not only in complete control of the American government, but believes herself as a victim of a male-dominated society that oppresses women. But she herself oppresses women with her mind control powers and how evil and corrupt she is. And she likes it. I mean, look at this. This is what she does to people who aren't on board with her human subjugation slavery program. That ultimate aim is to spearhead world domination, transforming the world into her own personal authoritarian society where she can do whatever she wants. But again, because this book tries to address how hard it is to be a woman in modern society, it's the same book where every character is a Jason-born Treadstone level assassin, but has kids that bully girls into prostitution, leaving them with pennies in their wallet and creepy old men conveniently around the corner to molest them. Not to mention how good the art can be sometimes, especially when the hentai artist is displaying a character's most valuable assets, and you can tell the artist is really putting in the work on some of these pages. I mean, seriously? You know this one's eating garlic bread. But one of the most egregious examples of this is this page. I mean, look how ridiculous this looks. Admittedly, sexual molestation on trains, cars, and groping is a problem in Japan, but this is incredibly dumb. First, we've got the drooling ugly bastard trope, right? Second, he's gotta squeeze around this girl's armpit to get to her cereal box prize. Third, he has to lift up her skirt to pull it out. Fourth, he's gotta remove the protective wrapper. And finally, 5, he can get his dirty little mitts on it and violate her. And if you look way over here, this one man's getting excited by the prospect of what's happening. But what makes this page dumb is there's virtually no way nobody's not seeing this, especially when showcasing the space in the train before and after the pages. So the question becomes, why is this in the story? Can the character not control his libido? Well, it's because it feels the men are walking pile of vomits narrative and justifies this man's very public execution. Even when I showed this page to one of my female friends in Japan, she even thought it looked ridiculous, with most groping on trains in Japan being extremely low-key from her point of view. So if I'm interpreting what she's saying correctly, nobody's going to be reaching this far. To say this book is absolutely wild is a complete understatement to what it's really about. Again, it tries to be about how systemic misogyny has been normalized in everyday society and survivors of abuse like Zack Snyder's Sucker Punch, but it just doesn't work, especially when there are scenes where the main protagonist talks about massive social reforms and uprooting the problems of society while directing everyone like puppets to do so. Then you have backstories where the main character is sexually assaulted by her mom's boyfriend, and as repudiation for this, for whatever reason I can't explain, the mom takes advice from Saki's mom from Metamorphosis playbook and uses an iron and burns half her face off, scarring her for life. So ultimately, at the end of the day, Hime is a book that takes actual problems about society and has characters twist those problems to suit whatever their perverse agenda is. Let it be world domination, carrying out degenerate sexual fantasies, or doing something else idiotic. Whereas all the sound and logical arguments about how mind control is bad and forcing people to understand your worldview under the threat of a gun is completely neglected. Which makes the book all the more funnier when a character finally catches the main character lacking and is an advocate of free will, shoots up a school on the orders of the Japanese government full of brainwashed slaves that can spread the main character's perverse ideology of what she perceives as an ideal world through her uterus vampire stingers that also just happen to kill men and brainwash women. Of course, he's the bad guy for believing in a slower progression towards these social reforms that should have already existed if people used common sense, and not forcing these ideals that should have been normalized behind the barrel of a gun is somehow a bad thing to believe in, and murders him for it. In cold blood. That's until he gets a brain transplant and becomes her worst enemy and says he cracked open the crystal meth on this book, and wait, what? Pause. Because I kinda sorta read the comments and I don't want to invalidate the suffering and trauma of women and men who have suffered sexual abuse and possibly worse, I like to say this book, the prior book, and everyone mentioned throughout this video are stories that are quite frankly so stupid I can hardly believe they're real, and or books that take logic and common sense to all its characters' graves for whatever reason the author decided, which invalidates and undermines their own message they've woven into the story. I mention this because some people are quite disturbed how flamboyantly I talk about these kinds of manga and crank jokes while laughing like a hyena most of the time, and quite frankly, most of these books in anime are either incredibly irritating to read or watch, or lacking artistic integrity when you look at the narrative as a whole, making everything that happened in the story just that stupid or knee-walking drunk when you're left wondering.
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
Do you see what I mean about this book? Hime continuously usurps the status quo of the world, jarringly changes things, and expects everyone to fall in love with her ideology, either by choice or under the barrel of a gun. The villains of this book are the villains and deemed evil because they're people who are sick of people like her telling everyday people what they can and are allowed to do. Therefore, if you've ever been sick of Hime dictating the trajectory of your life, in her eyes, you're a villain too. It's the same for all the characters with similar powers. Their egos and delusions of grandeur are staggering to the point where it's like a pigeon strutting around after taking a shit on a car window. They couldn't be more proud. Everyone handles trauma differently, with the most common occurrence of it being hurt people, but nobody fucks up as hard as these characters do in this book. It's not even a battle between themselves, wondering if they're strong enough to tackle the responsibilities they have with the power they have. Are they strong enough to contend with the worst parts of themselves, and can the power they wield weigh in their humanity? Are they strong enough to accept that maybe this is what their lives will be? Not winning, but failing and getting back up, knowing you could fail 100 more times and never give up. Nope! They immediately devolve and not realize the kind of violence they inflict onto others affects who they are. For example, we see the insane American queen gaining sexual gratification from harming people, dwelling in vice, vanity, and depraved mind control sex acts. Hime is the same too, but significantly worse in my opinion, with how apathetic she is as a human being. And that one time her friend almost died doesn't count, just like it didn't count in redo of a fucking healer. But to continue on with the remaining 25% of the plot that exists in the story, because my summary was 75% of the story, it's revealed that Hime's right-hand woman, the spiky-haired one, the real spunky, energetic one, I'ma call her Barbie, but her name isn't Barbie, but let's just call her Barbie. She isn't devoted to the main character because as it turns out, she's a wasp queen mind control vagina stinger lady too. But there's a caveat, because there's always something. She was only using Hime to kill the American queen, who I will now be referring to as Karen. To elaborate more on the story, as it turns out, Barbie was bitten by a wasp around Vietnam with the classic abused by parents story and discovered Karen existed, and wanted to use Hime as a distraction while Barbie tried to stab Karen in the back. Now, in the background of all that between Vietnam and current day, Barbie was able to amass an insane amount of wealth using her vagina mind control powers. However, what Barbie didn't account for is that when you have wasp queen mind control vagina powers, you get different powers based around whatever the magician pulls from his hat. Karen's power is control, Barbie's power is mimicry, and Hime, the main character's power, is domination. Out of those three powers, what do you think is the most powerful? Well, domination, of course, meaning Hime is the strongest character in the series, thus explaining why Barbie took the knee to Hime, because she dominated Barbie. In more specific terms, Hime is the most powerful wasp queen because she overrides the mind control of different queens and even making other queens subservient to her. Makes sense? And yes, if you're wondering, this is an 11th-hour reveal exposed at the tail end of the book. But what are the greater implications of this mic drop to the story? It's as I previously said, these female characters are imbued with these powers and attempt to usurp the status quo and change the world. But as each one of them continues their campaign to enrich the world, they all end up repeating the same solutions to different problems when they present themselves, leaving any sense of ethics in favor of their own ambitions, which is, again, all three of them, world domination. To be more specific, none of these characters began brainwashing and killing people because they hated people necessarily. It was an act of desperation because they ran out of options to try to satisfy their egos and bring their demented ideals to the center stage of the world. This is showcased early in the book when Hime reveals she's conquered Japan and is pretty much the president. Samus Winters revealed Karen has the Shadow Cabal controlling America, and with Barbie using her influence to try to rule the world through global economics. But what do all these characters have in common? Not only are they all incredibly stupid, they fall victim to their demons having zero self-reflection to accompany the violence these characters brought into the world. But with the ending of the story encroaching, what happens? The predictable, of course, Hime stabs Karen and they immediately become best friends, with Karen returning to the US to enforce Hime's insane propaganda, with her new ultimate aim being turning her into the president of the entire world. That is the ending of the book. The world is run on mind control and the threat of execution if anyone steps out of line. And, oh yeah, as it turns out, the wasp that previously bit all of the queens is possibly an alien's gender studies homework assignment, and or the possibility of a type 2 civilization that exists attempting to assimilate the human species into their insectoid-like colony. But those are ideas I don't even want to consider. Therefore, I'll contextualize what this book was about. Again, more so the philosophy or the ideology it leaves the reader believing regardless of whatever the author intended from my my POV. This is a book that views women as commodities, to be used sexually and otherwise. This all works in setting up a story that's very much inspired by the very brain cell Shuichi Kishimoto used to make Mad Chimera World, which I remind the audience is a book about a society dominated by women that use men for sex and then eat them like praying mantises. But I'm more so referring to how that tadpole turned himself into a robot so he could have sex with the main character's sister and smash rocks with his dick. But returning to the topic at hand, these women, the narrative circle, have more taken from them than anyone else, to have them gain extraordinary powers and use the same forms of oppressions that were used on them onto normal everyday people at great excess, policing how people should live, and most importantly, to populate a society where they can use everyone for their bodies, wants, needs, and pleasures, turning everything around them into something designed to exploit and break down people for the sake of demythologizing people who are in positions of power, creating a skewed power dynamic between them and the remainder of society, not to smash the patriarchy, but create a division of humanity where they view problems from a political lens instead of an empathetic and humanist perspective, where they can continue to champion their own beliefs while isolating the naysayers that could potentially poke holes in their perverse ideology, leading these characters down a path of polarizing hate and prejudice, thereby explaining why they do what they do. In a bid to take on the world as young adults against people who have more power than them, they ultimately use the power they've been gifted with against them for their own personal liberation and revenge against the world, solely because of their backstories. Not caring about how their actions will affect anyone physically or emotionally beyond themselves, they solely unravel into what they really are, no longer resembling who they were and irrevocably changing for the worse, not operating out of the greater good, but again, for their own personal liberation from an unbearable existence at any means. So trust me when I say if these women did what they did for a good reason, they'd certainly do it for a bad one too. What does this ultimately say about feminism? Honestly, do I have to explain it? If I do, I don't know.